Dr. Wilfred Riley, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University. He's written a fantastic book, among others, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Well, Professor, you see what's going on around you. You've been commenting on this, so let me get right to the crux of the matter. Is there systemic racism in our police departments in the aggregate?
Well, systemic or institutional racism as an academic is a phrase that I'm always a bit skeptical of. Now, obviously, if we want to be honest about some of this country's history, there have been systems like criminal sentencing in the past, where until quite recently you did see discrimination at kind of a broad, group-targeted level. But very often, this phrase simply means there's a difference in performance between two groups, and we're going to attribute that to racism. And to give an example of why that doesn't necessarily work, I mean, my favorite sports league, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, is more than 65% black. And I don't think any serious person would believe that that's because white jocks just don't get a fair shake in American society. The reason is that there's what you might call a cultural variable. African Americans play basketball more, and so on average, at the median, with all due respect to the hick from French Lick, we're better at it. White guys play more baseball, and if you look at MLB, that is a very heavily Caucasian and Hispanic athletic league. And you see this same thing in more what you might call serious situations all the time. So in 1995, the government economist June O'Neill, who's a liberal, as I understand, and the conservative researcher Dinesh D'Souza, who was fairly nonpartisan at the time, looked at the troubling fact that there is a gap between black and white incomes. As I recall, African Americans made 82% of what Caucasians did. And this was just universally attributed to racism. And what they found out was that that wasn't the case. There were a lot of quote-unquote variables involved. African Americans are a younger population. The most common age for a black man is 27. The most common age for a white man is 58. Obviously, people earn more later in life when they've had the chance to move into executive roles. African Americans are much more concentrated in the South, where wages are lower for everyone. If you adjust for these factors and just a couple of others, I mean years, not even quality of schooling, just staying in school, average performance on a test like the SAT, the gap almost disappeared. And you could argue that some of those things are tied into class and whatnot, but there's no pattern of businesses paying an absolutely equally qualified black guy and an absolutely equally qualified white guy different amounts in general. And I think that's a valuable lesson to take into life. So when people argue that policing is institutionally racist, almost always what they are saying is African Americans are arrested at a higher rate, or they encounter police at a higher rate than the black percentage of society would predict. But the obvious intermediary variable there is crime rate. If you look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics crime report, the African American crime rate for violent crimes where you encounter the police, whites dominate corporate crime, is 2.4 times the white rate. So you would expect there, unfortunately, to be more encounters between African Americans and the police. And when you look at this narrative about black people and the police being in constant conflict, not only does a lot of the structural element, perhaps not all of it, but a great deal, disappear if you adjust for crime rate, the figures themselves that are often used strike me as very, very inflated in terms of police violence. So there's a comprehensive database of police shootings and police killings maintained by the Washington Post newspaper. There's another one that's kept online and live at www.killedbypolice.net. And if you look at that Washington Post database, for some reason the figures change from time to time, but until about a week ago, the total number of unarmed men killed by police in the USA last year was listed as 9, unarmed black individuals. Total number of unarmed people, all races, all sexes, was only 56. There were only about 1,000 people of all backgrounds, armed or unarmed, killed by police, and only 229 of those were African American. And there's a lot of serious research that looks at types of violence other than just shooting, other than killing. So Roland Fryer, who is one of the youngest individuals ever to gain tenure at Harvard, and like me as a black man, took a comprehensive look at every type of police violence in a paper that came out in, I believe, 2016. And what he found is that there were some small gaps. African Americans were a bit more likely to be, for example, cursed at or lightly shoved. But when it came to extreme beatings or police shootings, African Americans, in the case of shootings, were actually 24.2 less likely, with everything along with race adjusted for, to be shot by the police than whites were. So I don't think you see a pattern of broad, systemic targeting, specifically of black people by the police today. That doesn't mean there aren't individual bad officers. I mean, we saw the horrifying George Floyd tape. I mean, my position is that charges should be filed against every one of the officers involved in that situation. But even there, the facts are a little more complex than they originally seemed to be. Two of the officers on the scene, as it turns out, Thao and Kung, if I have the names correct, are not Caucasian men. Floyd and Chauvin, the officer primarily responsible for the killing, had previously known one another from a nightlife security position. So I don't think we can just look at interactions between African Americans and the police and say, what we have here is an epidemic pattern of racism, a genocide, as Attorney Crump called it in a recent book.
All right, we'll be right back.
In times of trouble, your faith is always there for you. And at Fox Nation, we're helping.